John, thank you very much indeed. It's very good to be here with you. We've heard so many, in fact, rather similar themes, I think, from many of the speakers, but I think there's a very good reason for that, in fact, because the global environment and the war compels us to think along similar lines. Let me just make 3 points to you, if I may. The first is a very obvious one. But I completely share what has been said already. The war in Ukraine will have profound and durable consequences, but not only in the East, where it's most clear, but also in the South, in many different dimensions. Let me mention a few. It's causing us to rethink deterrence against actors who may be rational, but are also ruthless. This was not part of the traditional debate about deterrence during the Cold War. We also have to, I think, grapple not only in the East but also in the South with the problem of accumulated risk. Even if there is no intent to escalate, there is always a risk of things simply going wrong, of incidents that spin out of control, of misjudgments, of misinterpretation, and perhaps also of deliberate actions that go further than intended. So the risk of escalation, it seems to me, in the South, whether it's around the Black Sea or in the Eastern Mediterranean, as well as obviously in places like the Baltic, is very, very real. And the longer open-ended conflicts, whether they're active conflicts, wars, or simply confrontations go on, the higher this risk will be. And I think that's something that we need to reckon with. South in terms of energy, South in terms of infrastructure. These things have been mentioned already, but it all, I think, comes together in this point which I want to stress again, which is that although the focal point in many ways of the news is looking eastward, there is an intimate connection between what happens there and what happens in the South. The second point I would make is that Euro-Atlantic integration matters. This has been said too. You don't want to be a gray area. You don't want to have gray areas. You don't want to be left out. If I think the Finnish and Swedish aspiration to join NATO tells us anything, it is that there's a big difference between being close and being in. And that, I think, is going to shape our strategic environment for some time to come. In this context, I think the European Union is going to find itself absolutely in the business of becoming a more active geopolitical actor, including in hard power terms. Now, we may not all agree with the vocabulary that Josep Borrell used in his speech a few days ago, but his basic point was essentially correct. That the European Union's soft power matters, of course, but that this is no longer a world in which that's enough. And I think we should certainly recognize that. So the European Union has a role in security terms. Obviously, NATO has a role in security terms, but there are also all of these regional groupings we've been hearing about, whether it's the 3+1 in the Eastern Mediterranean, but also other things that we shouldn't take for granted. They're really very meaningful. The Abraham Accords, for example, between Israel and Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Sudan. This may seem like almost a normal concept today. It's a few years old. But if we were having this conversation 10 years ago, that would have seemed extraordinary, even unthinkable. So I think this is all being driven by a similar set of circumstances in which there is a strong desire to, if not be part of a key security architecture like NATO, at least not to be left out, to adhere to something, to have, I don't know what you could call it, borrowed security, which I think will be very important, whether it's through memberships or partnerships or other things. We didn't say too much about Ukrainian reconstruction, but that's coming too. And Euro-Atlantic integration is going to be intimately connected to the prospects for that success. I mean, the final point, and if I could end maybe on the point where Ambassador Garber also ended, I think in my view, the idea of an American disengagement from this region is a myth. If we look at political engagement, if we look at military presence, if we look at investment, I simply do not see that. Now, could circumstances over the next years arising in the Indo-Pacific cause this to change? Of course it could happen. Are there areas like the Western Balkans where Washington under any administration is likely going to look to Europe to lead? Absolutely. But in terms of a specific security engagement, geopolitical engagement in the Eastern Mediterranean and Southeastern Europe, I think that is pretty solid from the American side. And finally, I would say, if it has more European content, that's all to the good. I think the United States benefits from those partnerships, as the ambassador just mentioned, but I also think broadly shared in the American foreign policy establishment today, not shared everywhere, but broadly shared, is the idea that if more Europe allows European partners to spend more, do more in defense terms, that's helpful. And I think that's where we are today, and it will affect this region as much as it affects the East. So thank you very much.